All right. Thanks for your attention. So, the title of this is The Christmas Truce of 1914, and you may have noticed that the first song provided a bit of a spoiler. It's a very well-known event, but I wanted to dive a little deeper into how it came about and the experiences that occurred during that truce and the aftermath and historical perspective. So, it's really not my place to give a entire history of the First World War here, but just to give an idea of what was going on in December 110 years ago. The war started in August of 1914. You may have heard The Guns of August, title of a famous book about the beginning of the war. And it was an application of the domino theory in action. There was such a complex web of alliances across Europe at the time. So Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which caused Austria to declare war on Serbia. Then Russia, protecting Serbia, declared war on Austria. Germany then jumps in and declares war on Russia because they're allied with Austria. France declares war on Germany because they're allied with Russia. And then the UK and the Ottomans also were allied on each side. And Italy, I guess, didn't want to miss out on the fun, so they jumped in as well. And when the war started, Germany and France, they were not the principal belligerents. They were not the ones who actually began the hostilities, but they had been preparing for war with each other for decades because of a previous war in which Germany took over some French territory in Alsace-Lorraine. So the French wanted to recover their territory and get some measure of revenge. The Germans, of course, didn't want to lose this war, so they both had very elaborate plans, and they wanted to, each side, both the Germans and the French, were sure that once this war started, their plans would be successful, they would roll out their soldiers, they would conquer, the invading armies, and the troops would be home by Christmas. Well, that's not exactly how it worked out. And after the initial confrontations, the Germans and French, in just across the Rhine in France, started to try to outflank each other. Each side wanted to be able to maneuver around the edge of the enemy lines, the Germans into France, the French into Germany, and those famous trenches that everybody thinks of when they think about World War I, they started out because they wanted to fortify the positions that they already had and use the troops that were left to try and outmaneuver the enemy. And each side did this, and neither side could get a decisive advantage. And they started somewhere around the eastern edge of France, and they just kept going further and further west, and it was called the Race to the Sea. And eventually, this huge line of trenches and fortifications sprawled from the Swiss-French border all the way to the English Channel. So there was this impenetrable line of trenches strung across northern Europe, and you had the Germans and the French sitting there. The final goal of that was reached in October. So a couple of months of this maneuvering and trench digging, and there they were, sitting in the trenches, not that far from each other, sometimes as close as 100 yards, and rarely more than a mile apart. And, of course, there were artillery emplacements on both sides. They would bombard each other with artillery. They would fire machine guns at each other. But really, a lot of these soldiers, the British, the French, the Germans, they did not really see the sense of this war. We hear a lot about war protests. Everybody here, we know about the protests that took place for Vietnam, for the Gulf Wars, and on the other side, you have the governments doing the Support the Troops initiative. That was somebody 100 years ago would have recognized that because you had the government propaganda. You had the peace activists singing, "I didn't raise my son to be a soldier," And then some of the pro-war activists, they wrote a counter song called "I Didn't Raise My Son to Be a Slacker," and they just, you know, there was a lot of mixed feelings in there, and of course nobody wants to go and get their head shot off or get blown up by an artillery shell. So as the months moved on, we went from October to November to December. Some of the soldiers decided that they were going to not, they couldn't mutiny. You know, there wasn't the opportunity to just lay down their guns and walk away. But they adopted this live and let live attitude, and they wanted to at least try and be courteous and humane to each other in the midst of fighting a war. And so even before Christmas, even before December, there were some opportunities for these soldiers to observe mutual truces. For example, the rations on both sides would usually be delivered around dusk, and they sort of observed an unofficial ceasefire. They would, everybody would sit down and eat their food and not go over the top to attack the enemy, and likewise not fire artillery across the trenches. They would just have an hour or so to eat and rest in peace. And there were also, in certain areas, again, informal agreements. This was not national policy, but there would be agreements that there would be maybe once a week or once every few days, there would be an hour or two where soldiers from each side could go over and recover the bodies of their dead. And, you know, they, despite the brutality of the war, everybody agreed that the dead soldiers should have a dignified burial if possible, so they let the other side come over and recover their fallen. So as this went on, most of this was initiated by the lower ranks, the enlisted men, the non-commissioned officers, even some of the lower ranking officers, the lieutenants and captains. The higher you went up the military hierarchy, of course, the less it was approved. And the generals, of course, they saw this as a very dangerous thing. You know, they wanted to win the war. You know, obviously they didn't like the idea of mass deaths any more than anyone else, but they didn't want to be you know, to lose because of a lack of fighting spirit on their part. So some of the things that they would do is they would order raids into enemy territory, and you know, they would say, you know, you can't just sit there and yell at each other. You have to actually get there, you know, go across into the trenches, raid the trenches, and, you know, do some killing for your side, as it were. And the soldiers on both sides, some of them were quite clever. They found ways to get around even this. You know, in some cases they would just outright lie and say that they had conducted a raid when they hadn't. And sometimes they would go over to the enemy side and they might find some artifacts like a coil of barbed wire or a box of ammunition or an old uniform, and they'd bring them back to their side, and then they would say to their commanders, oh yes, we raided yesterday, here's a piece of barbed wire from their trench, or, you know, here's a button from a German uniform. And you know, but this was all it was not a mass movement. It was a lot of little individual things. So you might have on the front, you might have one stretch of territory where the British and Germans, or the French and Germans, might call out greetings to each other during the truce periods, and then, you know, a mile away there would be shelling going on and no such truce was being observed. One interesting thing between the different armies, the Germans, I found it interesting that 100, 110 years ago, as now, there were a lot of foreign workers in London. And in the early 20th century, many of them were German. And so you would get these German soldiers who a few years before had been living and working in England, and they learned to speak English, and they would they would call out. Sometimes they would say, "We're going to kill you, Tommy," and sometimes they'd literally say, "How are you getting on over there?" And there was one general actually related a story of how during one of these exchanges, a young German soldier walked over to him and said, "General Bradshaw, how are you doing? I haven't seen you in a while." And he said, "When did we meet?" And he's like, "Don't you remember? I was the maitre d' at such and such restaurant 10 years ago." And so that was, there was some communication able to go on between the soldiers. And as Christmas approached in 1914, these people, they're human, they're Christian, they've got their traditions, and from the accounts that I've read, it was mostly the Germans who actually started doing things such as decorating the trenches. They literally would put up Christmas trees, and they'd put candles on the trees, and they'd light candles near the trenches. And there was a lot of singing going on. Many of these soldiers brought instruments from home, or they would just organize choruses. And the Germans tended to be a little more patriotic, and they would often sing Deutschland über alles, and the English kind of got annoyed with that, and they decided that they're going to sing some songs of their own. And getting close to Christmas, they practiced all the Christmas carols they could and kind of sang them in counter harmony. Now, here's an interesting callback. You may recall a few years ago I talked about J.R.R. Tolkien, and his account of the beginning of the world in Middle-earth was literally a group of songs being sung by these higher powers, and the evil power tried to disrupt it with his own songs, and in return they sang a counter harmony that overcame or blended with it. And I really have to wonder, Tolkien was a soldier. He was in the trenches in the First World War, and I wonder if that might have been a little bit of inspiration. There's no proof of it, but it's just a speculation on my part about that. So once it got to be Christmas time, as I said, this was not something that was observed universally. However, based on the records, based on letters that people sent back home, and records from the official military histories, it seems like about 100,000 British and German soldiers took part in some sort of truce activities at various spots along the trench lines. So again, some of them wrote that during these meetings they could hear the artillery firing, so obviously it wasn't going on everywhere. On the other hand, there were some places where there were long stretches of lines where no fighting was going on, and as you heard in the first song, there were times when people would just get up out of the trenches, and this was kind of an act of faith, even on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, because you never knew. All it would take is one enemy soldier to decide, this guy's a perfect target. But for the most part, we didn't see a lot of that kind of betrayal of trust. Instead, they chose to trust each other, to celebrate the peace of Christmas, and you would wind up with these British and German or British and French soldiers meeting up, and they would exchange it wasn't a very luxurious life in the trenches, but certain sides had different things than others. Reading some of the accounts, it seemed like the French had better sweets, and the Germans had tobacco and pipe tobacco and cigars and schnapps, and the English had some some food that was more appetizing to the Germans, and so they went over and they would trade their food and tobacco, and then there were people who just wanted to collect souvenirs. There were many stories of soldiers trading caps. This one fella wanted to collect some German buttons, and he had a pair of wire cutters. You know, his normal assignment was to go out and try to cut through the barbed wire and raid the trenches. And so he went up to one of the German soldiers and showed him the wire cutters, and they didn't speak the same. You know, they didn't speak any German or any English, respectively. But you know, they cut a couple of buttons off each other's jackets and traded those. And they had. There was a lot of, you know, as I said, a lot of chatting, a lot of trading. One British captain who wrote back about this account said, if I had seen this in a cinematograph film, I would have sworn it was faked. And you know, back in 1914, there were newsreels. They did have moving picture technology, and they did have the idea of you know, faking these things for publicity stunts. But there's enough account to say that no, this was not fake. This was actually happening. And the singing of Christmas carols, again, in that first song they mentioned "Silent Night," which is a popular Christmas tune both in English and in German. Another one, they apparently both sides knew "Auld Lang Syne," and they wound up singing that in several locations. So they had these exchanges and these sing-alongs. The amount of time that it lasted, again, that was not universal. There were some places where the fighting started again as early as the afternoon of Christmas Day. And there were other places where the truce lasted as long as New Year's Day. There was one British captain recorded in his diary, he said, invitation to a soccer game with Saxon soldiers on New Year's Day. But apparently that particular game never took place. The fighting resumed before New Year's Day. But that soccer game, or, you know, games, that's one of the most famous accounts, and also one of the hardest to really nail down in terms of documentation. There are a few stories. Some of those stories were not even found until after the war. You know, diaries of soldiers who didn't publish them. There was also, in general, news of the truce was suppressed by the press censors on both sides. You know, neither side wanted this news to get out that soldiers are refusing to fight and having fun with each other in the trenches. So it was at least a couple of weeks or months before the news got out to the general public of this. But there are a few accounts where we have letters and diary entries from both sides of some of these games taking place. Now, what somebody has pointed out, some of the historians, is that, you know, the terrain of no man's land. You know, at this point, it wasn't years, but it had been months of shelling and artillery fire and bad weather, and the ground was just completely churned up. There were craters, there were tree roots, there was debris, and so it wasn't exactly a good place for a soccer game. But there are some attested accounts of soccer games on one side, like the British. The British did play a few games. Another thing is that okay, you can see that some people would have brought musical instruments along. Not a whole lot of soldiers brought a soccer ball to the war, but there is an account, and this seems to be one of the ones that has been verified, of some soldiers playing a sort of unofficial soccer game using an empty meat tin as the ball. So, you know, you do what you can, and we've got some interesting accounts of that, and you know, they had. I was glad to see these accounts of people actually being able to enjoy themselves in the midst of all this. But they overall they had no illusions. You know, there's an account of one of the German soldiers saying, "Tomorrow we'll be fighting again, but today I'm happy to talk to you." And some of the soldiers were not in favor of this whole truce idea either. Interesting thing that I read is one particular corporal in the German lines who later went on to write a book about his struggle wrote that he thought that the truce was a terrible idea. I wasn't surprised to hear that. But as I said, the military hierarchy, the higher you got up the ranks, the less in favor of it they were. And even as it was happening and immediately after, they started to take measures and try to make sure that something like this would not become a regular thing. The German High Command, as soon as December 29th of 1914, issued a general order saying that any fraternization with the enemy would be treated as treason. So there was always the possibility of getting punished by your own side for doing something like that. And even some of the truces to recover bodies. There's an account of one British captain who negotiated a truce to recover the dead and let the Germans do the same. This was in, I believe, 1915 or 16, and he was court-martialed. He was told, this is against orders. You should not have done that. But after the court-martial had handed down his sentence, the War Ministry actually intervened and commuted his sentence. So he was reprimanded. Officially, it wasn't supposed to happen, but at least he avoided punishment for it. One of the things that I also read on the French side, they actually had some regiments of soldiers from the African colonies who were stationed behind the lines, and their whole purpose for being there was basically to punish treason, either to capture deserters or to punish those who were trying to perpetuate these truces. And I guess the thinking of the French High Command was that these people, not being from Europe, might have less of a stake in this and be willing to just follow the orders. I didn't read any direct accounts of people being getting caught and punished in that way, but that relates to the second song that I played, which that song is, you may notice they started talking about hanging on the wire like a scarecrow. That was the sights that you saw of the soldiers who died in the raids to go over the top. And then the second verse about the man being executed by firing squad. There were many soldiers on both sides who either refused to go over the top and make these attacks when they were ordered, or they were suffering from shell shock. And today we would identify it as PTSD. Over the years, and it's mostly in war that it was first identified. But the higher officers, not understanding this, they would see it as cowardice, and they saw it as desertion and treason. And there were, unfortunately, soldiers who were put to death for refusing to fight. And there are also records, as we go on past 1914, there were a few truces that happened. You can't suppress them everywhere, but there's a record of in Easter 1915, some Germans tried to approach the British lines, and the British warned them off. I didn't get the exact account of what happened, but maybe they fired a warning shot, maybe they just yelled at them to go back to the trenches or whatever. But and also, as it came to Christmas of 1915, 1916, the military command would order barrages on Christmas Day, and basically, the artillery people, they were in on a lot of the truces too, because they had to agree not to fire, but they were not as closely involved in the front lines. And once again, they didn't have quite as much skin in the game, so the commanders could order the artillerymen to fire on Christmas morning, and, well, what can you do? You got your orders. So that is one of the ways that this this phenomenon of the truce, it didn't lead to a mass desertion and an end to the war. However, there's only so far you can push people, and looking back on the historical perspective, because the Allies won the war, and because most of us Americans, read the stories written from the perspective of the American and British side, the Germans were portrayed as the aggressors, and they were not innocent. But out of all the nationalities participating in the war, the Germans were not the most enthusiastic. The rank and file soldiers who were there in the trenches, many of those Germans, and even many of the sailors in the German Navy, they thought that the whole thing was senseless. And they're like, what is Austria-Hungary to us, and what is the war between Russia and Austria to us? And if you recall the history, once it got to the end of the First World War, what finally convinced the Germans that to lay down their arms was a mass desertion in the Navy and a general strike among the workers on the home front. So, sooner or later, people reach a point where they have had enough of war. And thinking about how this happened in the First World War in 1914, you move ahead to subsequent wars. Now, in World War II, obviously nothing of the sort, or very little of the sort, has been recorded. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is the more powerful, more efficient weapons. There was more aerial bombardment, there was more naval warfare, and even the firearms that the soldiers carried by hand had a longer range. In the First World War, as I said, they were literally close enough that they could yell across the trenches and hear each other. In the Second World War, there was very little of that. And even if there was, of course, the character of the war was much different. You had, very few Americans or British were going to sympathize with the Nazis or the Japanese. It was a completely different story. And today, this is one of the things that is very unfortunate with the political atmosphere today. Is wars are so depersonalized. You read about things that are going on in Ukraine, in Gaza, and again, it's missiles, it's bombs, it's aerial attacks. We've got mass media. We can see on a more personal level the people who are dying and make appeals to the public, but the actual people on the front lines are not confronting each other face to face, and that's because of that. I think they're more reluctant to say we can't be doing this, or at least we can have a time of truce and respect for each other, even if it's only temporary. So, I just to conclude, I see this as a at least an illustration of hope and humanity. And it may not happen in the wars we have today, but I do see it happening in some places. People on different sides, sometimes they will decide that, okay, time to stop, Time to lay down the arms, time to lay down the arguments, and just treat each other humanely. And the final words that I wanted to share here come from a period after the war. And this was actually from Kemal Ataturk, who was the leader of Turkey, not the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was one of the empires that fell as a result of the war. But there was an enormous battle at Gallipoli between the Ottoman Empire and soldiers from mostly Australia and New Zealand. And many of those Australian and New Zealander soldiers, they died there and their bodies never made it back home. They were buried with dignity in Turkey. And 20 years after the war, in 1934, Kemal Ataturk sent a message to there were organizations for the mothers, the families of fallen soldiers. And Ataturk sent this message to Australia and New Zealand. He said, "Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore rest in peace. There's no difference between the Johnnies on your side and the Mehmets on our side to us, where they lie side by side in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well." And I can't think of a better way for countries to make peace and make amends than by thinking like that.